My name's Jan McVarish. I'm the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. Welcome to the big Bill of Rights debate. We've got a packed room here in London and another 450 or so members joining us online. So we're actually going to run a poll tonight for the first time, before and after the debate. In the room, it's going to be a hands-up poll, and then online we'll do a Zoom poll. So that's already showing, I think, for the online audience, and you can start voting now. It's just to try and get your views before we even discuss the subject. So to introduce what we're going to be debating tonight. So many free speech enthusiasts envy the US's First Amendment, and I know it's something that comes up a lot at our events. Passed in 1791, the foundation stone of the Constitution, enshrines as a primary value that Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. So this very simple clarity has acquired enormous historical and patriotic significance, and those concerned about Britain's free speech crisis often crave such a foundational protection against each new encroachment on our right to free expression, and never more so than in the last few years, in fact, the last few months as well. However, there are plenty of sceptics who argue that constitutional reform over here would not shore up the defence of free speech. Rather, they argue we should reinforce the principles of English common law, whereby that which is not expressly illegal is a freedom to be enjoyed by each individual. Giving greater power to judges, lawyers, and courts, they say, is disempowering of us, the demos. So this is a debate, as I said, that comes up at a lot of our events and in just conversations that we might have. And I think, generally speaking, people tip towards the view that a First Amendment or equivalent would be a very good thing in Britain. So because we're the Free Speech Union, we like to be a bit contrarian. Our first speaker is going to speak for the motion, which is actually the opposite of hopefully what a lot of people think. A Bill of Rights would not protect free speech. So we're running the poll now, so online. So do enter your verdict prior to the debate happening, and we'll find out what that result is in a moment. In the room, how many people, put your hand up if you think a Bill of Rights would protect free speech?
Minority.
A minority. That's not what I just before we go to the other side, how many people are undecided and are waiting for the result of the debate? Okay, that slightly changes things. And then how many people think it would not protect free speech? Okay, that's a more even split. Okay, but slightly.
I'll buy the beers for you people later.
Well, just don't lose them.
Just don't lose them.
Terrible.
No, don't lose them. Very bad.
So, Vinay, what are the results at home?
This is working. Okay, so at the minute, most people are undecided. That's 54% of people are undecided. People who say no, that's 28%. And people who say yes is 18%. So the winner is undecided.
Very English.
Yeah.
Very British.
We're so reasonable. So sorry, and they're answering no to the question: would a Bill of Rights would not protect free speech? Just clarify.
Yes, they are. That's the question. A Bill of Rights would not help protect free speech in the UK.
So what was the yes result?
18%.
Okay, so most people think it would protect free speech, apart from the undecideds, who are the majority. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm practically enumerate, so that's why I need to clarify.
The double negative confused a lot of them.
I know. It's James's fault because he wanted to put forward this provocative motion. So what we'll do is we'll have questions later from the room and also from the online audience. So if you're online, please write your question in the Q&A box as the debate goes on. The chat is closed tonight because that can be a bit of a distraction. So just post your question, ideally in the form of a question in the Q&A box. And what would be really helpful is if you actually wrote down who it was you wanted us to ask the question to. So James or Preston, or both, in fact. So just try and do that, and we'll come back to the Q&A box later. Okay, so I'm now going to introduce our speakers. So speaking for the motion that a UK Bill of Rights would not protect free speech, he's flown all the way from Australia I'm going to say especially to speak to us, but I'm not sure that's quite true. But it sounds good. So Professor James Allan is Garrick Professor of Law at the University of Queensland, and he has a special interest in legal and moral philosophy, constitutional law and bills of rights. He's previously taught in New Zealand, the USA and Hong Kong, but he was born, I think you spent time over here as well, didn't you?
Yeah, at King's College.
Yeah, King's. And he was born in Canada and practiced law in Toronto and in London. Professor Allan is opposed to bills of rights and has been actively involved in the efforts trying to stop one from being enacted in Australia. He sets out his stall in his latest book, this one, which I was cramming. In fact, I've scribbled all over. We haven't got them on sale, but you can go and find it in the usual places. That was published in 2022, but he also writes for The Australian, The Spectator, Spectator Australia, Quadrant, and The Daily Sceptic. In the opposite corner, you'll hear from Preston Byrne, who's really has flown all the way from the US to be with us tonight. He's a senior fellow at the Adam Smith Institute. You're still a senior fellow there, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, but you were in London
I mean,
working.
as far as I know, yes.
Yeah, okay. Adjunct professor at Fordham Law School and managing partner of the law firm Byrne and Storm PC. He's advised internet and social media companies on global free speech and censorship issues since 2018. And in 2020, he wrote a paper for the Adam Smith Institute called Sense and Sensitivity, Restoring Free Speech in the United Kingdom. I'd really recommend you look that up. It's really, really interesting. And he also drafted a law, the UK Free Speech Act, which would create a First Amendment-style free speech right for the UK. So again, you can go and look up, if you just Google Preston Byrne, you'll find out, and you'll also see his video interview on GB News as well. So, first of all, I'm going to invite James to go to the lectern and make his case.
Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. I got special dispensation to start with a little story about Toby before my time starts, because I ran into Toby Young at the very beginning of lockdowns when the world went crazy and there was censorship, and I think I was the first subscriber to Daily, or what was then the Lockdown Skeptic. But Toby, we now have to call him Lord Young of Acton. He has been ennobled. He is a peer of the realm, so they don't make terrible choices 100% of the time. He's the only good choice they've probably made in a while. But Toby came out last year as a guest of various free speech people in Australia. And he'd want me to tell you the story. He was on a beach in just outside of Brisbane on the Gold Coast. And he was walking along, it was a beautiful day. And he stumbled over this Arabic-looking bottle. He stood up and he inadvertently rubbed it. And this genie came out. Now, Toby's a pretty clever guy, and so he first said to the genie, "Do I get 3 wishes?" And she said, she looked just like Barbara Eden, by the way, and she said, "You do get 3 wishes, but I'm a very special genie. So for everything you ask for, you'll get it. But you have to know that everybody in Britain and Australia who's against free speech, who are in favor of the thuggish lockdowns, who believe in shadow banning and censorious conduct, they will get 2. So Toby thought for a while, and she said, "What's your first wish?" And he said, like £1 million. So she blinked her eyes. She said, "You go home tonight, check your bank account, you'll have £1 million. But remember, every single censorious, anti-free speech, pro-lockdown person in both countries will have £2 million. What's your second wish?" Toby, he said, "I wouldn't mind a top-of-the-line German sports car." Well, they're still making them before, you go down the crazy electric road. So she blinked her eyes. She said, "Go home. It'll be in your driveway at home. But remember, every single person who wants to hammer free speech and, impose draconian lockdowns, they'll have 2. She said, "Now, what's your third and final wish?" Now, Toby's a canny guy. He looked at her, and after a while he said, "I've always wanted to donate a kidney." If you have been educated in the last 5 years, you will not understand that joke. I will have to explain it to you later. Okay, so here's the thing about tonight. We're not arguing about substance. I'm a potent free speech person. I'm a conservative law professor. I spent my entire life working in left to hard left institutions. I hated the censoring of information during lockdowns. I think I was the first person in Australia to come out in print and say Donald Trump would win. I had bets in The Spectator every week. So I strongly believe in free speech. So we do not disagree in substance. This is an argument about how do you get to where you want to get to. And just to let you know, Australia is the only sort of democratic country right now without a national Bill of Rights. You have more scope to speak your mind in Australia right now, today, in terms of hate speech, in terms of campaign finance laws, than you do in Britain. You have a statutory Bill of Rights with your Human Rights Act. Canada has an incredibly potent, entrenched, constitutionalized Bill of Rights, and there's way more scope to speak your mind in Australia than here. I could go through all the countries. The US is an outlier. We'll come back to that. Because one of the things I'm going to argue is you simply cannot recreate the US First Amendment. If you think you can, you just are wrong. And one of the things you will see when you look at all of the cases from all the common law jurisdictions is when you buy a Bill of Rights, all you are buying is the first order preferences of the unelected judges. If you think that Britain can have a set of judges that include Clarence Thomas, then it might be worth a punt. In fact, Britain had 14 Supreme Court judges who were all Remainers who decided two of the worst Miller cases of all time. The first one was on the prerogative power, and the second was on proroguing Parliament. It's their first order preferences, because the Bill of Rights sets out a set of moral entitlements, in the language of rights, and they have every right you can translate into a rule. So if you have the right to free speech, here's a rule that in these circumstances you can speak your mind. Rules feel constraining. People don't like the language of rules. When you talk about rights, you have this frisson of excitement that goes down your spine, the sense of entitlement. But you always articulate rights in highly amorphous general terms, the Olympian heights of moral abstractions. But you apply them down in the sort of day-to-day life of specific line drawing. There's only two groups that can draw lines. Your elected parliament can draw lines, and they're not doing a very good job in England right now, or the unelected judges can draw lines. It is just a fact. When we look around the Anglosphere right now, the common law world, we have the most activist judges that we have seen in 100 years. Israel and India are beyond belief. The Canadian judges have just decided that they can they can second-guess statutes of parliament. Right? We know what's happening in Britain with your judiciary, because if you get a Bill of Rights, the underlying assumption that everyone seems to make is these things interpret themselves. And so the judges will interpret these clear words the way I would interpret them, but that's just not true. In Australia, there was a big case during lockdown, Section 92 Section 92 of the Constitution was about trade and commerce would be absolutely free between the states. You can't get anything drafted clearer than absolutely free. And I went to the High Court of Australia, and they interpreted absolutely free as not absolutely free. We're going to bring in the proportionality principle, and we will decide whether you can move between the states. And of course, the answer was no, because the judges loved lockdowns. They were afraid they were going to die. They loved it. And so the first thing you have to remember is no written law interprets itself. And the days when judges were sort of faithful to the intended meaning of the lawmakers, they are largely gone. There is an exception in the US. They have a small group of judges that we call originalists that Donald Trump put on the court. But if you go back to 2016 and Hillary Clinton had won, and the 3 open spots on the US Supreme Court had been appointed by Hillary Clinton, you would have inroads on free speech in the US already. Turned out Biden didn't get a pick. The Americans also have a highly politicized appointment process. You guys in this country have one of the worst processes ever, brought to you by David Cameron. I mean, Tony Blair ruined your Constitution, but David Cameron did what he could to help make it even worse. You have a judicial appointments process, and this was supposed to be based on merit. You know how it works? They have 13 people. 6 of them are the great and the good of the lawyerly caste. The Lord Chief Justice, the Master of the Rules, the head of the Bar Association, the head of the Law Society. Like, these are walking judicial sort of godlike figures. And then you have 7 people who are plumbers, secretaries, sewer workers. And we are supposed to believe that those 7 lay people, when they're in discussions about who the next judge should be with the Lord Chief Justice of England, that they're going to outvote those 6. You've got to be kidding me. You have a system where judges pick their own replacement. I can't imagine a worse system. How do you get outliers? So the first thing that needs to happen in this country is a new government has to repeal the Judicial Appointments Act. It's terrible. Go back to what Australia does, Canada does, New Zealand does. The government that wins appoints the judges. You also need to get rid of the Human Rights Act. You need to leave the European Convention. Here's another thing. If you want to look at how bills of rights perform during lockdowns, which I think Jonathan Sumption is right, were the biggest inroads on all of our civil liberties, including free speech, in the last 200 to 300 years, how many cases can you find from around the common law world where judges using a Bill of Rights stepped in and did anything to alleviate the thuggery of lockdowns? And the answer rhymes with the 5th Roman emperor, the pyromaniac. For those of you who aren't well educated, the answer is 0. Here's another thing you need to bear in mind, because my claim is, and I think there's loads of evidence for it, when you buy a Bill of Rights, you buy the views of lawyers and judges. 50 to 60 years ago, there's lots of data on this in the States because when you donate to political parties in the US, it's public information. The median voter was to the left of the lawyerly caste 60 years ago. In other words, lawyers, and I generalize as a group, were more politically conservative back then than your median voter. That is not true today. The lawyerly caste is at least a standard deviation, maybe 2, to the political left of the median voter. So what a Bill of Rights does is it empowers the lawyerly caste, and they value equality more than freedom, and they're more politically left than the median voter. By all means, hand more power to them with a... Here's another thing. You can't buy... We can all agree that there is this outlying First Amendment, which is only there because there's 100 years of case law in the US. And even judges find it hard to deal with 100 years of case law, although in the first Miller case here on the prerogative power, the judges blithely overturned 300 years of precedent. But don't worry about that. The thing about the US First Amendment is, even if you mimicked it word for word, and then you said in some sort of subtext or preamble, and all of the precedents that they follow in the US, we will also follow, the judges here wouldn't do it. They'd look at European law, they'd read in a proportionality principle. You would not get what you think you're going to get. And we're supposed to be hard-nosed about this, right? I could go through what's happening in Canada with the judges, in Australia. We don't have a Bill of Rights, and even then the judges are trying to do things that you think are bizarre. So here's the thing. How do you constrain someone who's, interpretation is the goal of trying to interpret what some other person meant, a lawmaker. Let's say your girlfriend says to you, I'd like to meet you at the cinema tonight. And then she loses her cell phone and you're trying to think, as an interpreter, your job is to think, what did she mean? Which cinema did she mean? And there might be evidence for it. Maybe you and she always go to the same cinema every Friday night. That's good evidence. Or maybe she was talking about a new cinema. But here's what's not interpretation. If you said to yourself, I don't know what she meant, but there's this new cinema I really like, comfortable chairs, glass of wine. So I'm going to interpret, let's go to the cinema as, let's go to the one I want to go to. That is not interpretation. That's legislating from the bench. And the law schools for the last 30 years, they're rife with this idea of a living constitution or living tree interpretation, where the judges are there to keep pace with civilization. Just look at how they're interpreting your Human Rights Act. Look at Guyton and Mendoza, where the judges said in Guyton and Mendoza, when it comes to your Human Rights Act, we can read words in. This is quoting. You can read words out. We can ignore the clear intention of Parliament. That's what they said. Good luck trying to recreate a First Amendment. And so the problem is when you hand this over to the judges, I want free speech, but you know what? It's going to be hard. It's a hard political battle. And what we need to do is remember it's a hard, you're not going to get a First Amendment. I guess a blunt way of putting it is the rule of law is being corrupted around my words, corrupted around the common law world into a sort of enervated rule by judges or rule by the lawyerly caste. We need to take power away from lawyers. We need to take power away from judges and not give them more power. So the fight for free speech is going to be a political one. As I said, you've got to get rid of your Judicial Appointments Act. You're going to have to get rid of the Public Order Act. You're going to have to do the sort of thing that Donald Trump, to be honest, is doing. You have to set, and that, it's not going to be easy. People, you can't rely on the sort of privileged caste to do the hard work for you. And so I suppose one other thing you need to do is deal with the law schools. Because as bad as judges and the lawyerly caste are today, it's going to be worse in the future. I work in law schools, and they are way more left-wing than they've ever been. They subscribe to what I think are really bizarre views about interpretation, about the role of there's an underlying disdain for democracy. I'm not exaggerating about this. The underlying view amongst law schools and some of the lawyerly caste is you really can't trust plumbers and secretaries. Did I say that with enough seeming contempt? You haven't got a law degree. What's wrong with you? And so Preston is going to set out the wonders of the American First Amendment, and to some extent I agree with him. What he's not going to be able to do is he's not going to be able to show you any plausible way on earth that you can recreate that here. And it's not even 100%, as I said, that the Americans will be able to keep it. They have been very lucky. The three most recent nominees were all made by Trump in his first term, and then Biden got none. Take those three away and put 3 Hillary Clinton judges in and see what would have happened to all sorts of areas of U.S. law. Because again, when you buy a Bill of Rights, you are buying the views, the druthers, the preferences, the substantive values of the judges and lawyers who interpret them. And I would never be in the game of giving them more power. So I'm happy and look forward to answering questions. The thing about the double negative just reminded me in passing about the famous linguist, philosopher from Oxford, who was giving a talk to a working man's club. And he decided he was going to tell them all about how the English language is quite unique because there are many, many, many different ways that you can have a double negative, but there's no way to have a double positive. And a guy at the back, a plumber, said, "Yeah, right."
Good evening, everyone. Just to be clear here, Professor Allen and I agree entirely on the objectives, right, of why we're all here. Everyone in this room wants to see free speech in this country once again, right, if not for the first time, depending on how fundamentalist you are about that question. Really, the only thing we disagree on are the means of how to do this. And so what we're here to do tonight, I've prepared some remarks. Usually I do it off the cuff, but I decided I was going to prepare remarks tonight. We're here to discuss the world's 2 great charters of liberty, the American Bill of Rights and the European Convention of Human Rights, which is law in this country as a result of the Human Rights Act 1998. One of these laws has succeeded wildly in protecting free speech both at home and abroad. The other one is the European Convention. So the reason one of these works and the other one doesn't is actually pretty simple. It's that nobody lost their job after the European Convention became the law of the UK in 2000. This is because the convention was not designed to act as a bulwark against state power. It was designed to serve the interests of the government. The convention rights were created during the Cold War to allow the nations of the West to pay lip service to basic human rights while also creating carve-outs. In the case of free speech, this is Article 10, Sub 2, which permitted derogations or deviations from these rights where the so-called interests of a democratic society were threatened. This feature was designed to allow European countries to waive fundamental rights and freedoms to crack down on communist subversion and other forms of authoritarianism. What the drafters did not recognize or foresee is that the communists, specifically the post-communist intersectional theorists and the wokes, would one day seize control of most of our institutions, including the universities and the civil service, and weaponize the European Convention against the very people it was designed to protect. For this reason, the European Convention, far from protecting the rights of the British people, has been turned against them time and again by the police and the courts at every level. We see this in the variable treatment of the pre-Human Rights Act and post-Human Rights Act public order cases. Take, for example, 1999's Redmond Bate, compared to 2011's DPP and Hammond, both of which involve street preachers espousing traditional notions of Christian morality. Redmond Bate resulted in an acquittal, Hammond in a conviction. Most similar cases today, when brought, result in convictions. There are, of course, occasional outliers where the courts, under public pressure, go the other way, such as they did in Miller and college policing in 2021. Overwhelmingly, however, the UK's politicians, its jurists, and its police regard free speech as a limited right, and they treat it as such. Contrast this with the US Bill of Rights, which was not merely a statement of rights, but part of a complete constitutional overhaul designed to overthrow and replace the British system of parliamentary supremacy with systems of procedural safeguards and, in the case of the Second Amendment, kinetic safeguards. The Bill of Rights not only fired the English Parliament and an English king, it fired all parliaments. It fired all kings, and it granted the people rights to both forestall their emergence and the means to violently overthrow them. The US Bill of Rights is an anti-government document, Articles of Surrender, crafted by a group of heavily armed fundamentalist libertarians after winning a bloody war. Simple as that. The European Convention is a pro-government document, drafted by a group of government bureaucrats in the Council of Europe to protect themselves and save their own skins. The First Amendment was also designed in direct opposition to the UK's laws at the time, principally those which outlawed blasphemy, high treason, seditious libel, and scandalum magnatum, the slander of great men of the realm, all of which, for the most part, have been formally abolished here, where mere speech is concerned. However, all of these laws have been replaced by new rules that achieve the same objectives via different means. The UK's modern censorship laws go by names like the Public Order Act, the Communications Act, the Online Safety Act, the Terrorism Act. This is probably the only room in the world where I can reference these laws and no explanation of their content is required, which is very convenient, and I'm not going to get into exactly what's in them. What does require explaining, however, in case it isn't clear, is the function that they serve. The purpose of a system is what it does. Remember this, the purpose of a system is what it does, and what the UK's speech laws do is enforce woke political orthodoxy at gunpoint. These orthodoxies are an invasive species, they are not native to these lands, and they derive from a progressive political project principally emanating today from the United States and its earlier progenitors from the Frankfurt School. Try expressing an idea contrary to that orthodoxy in a public manner in England. Criticize immigration policy. Reject the idea that men can turn into women. Interview someone who holds officially disfavored views, as Darren Grimes found out when he interviewed David Starkey in 2020, or especially attempt to do any of aforementioned things using coarse language. And the least bad thing that will happen to you will be the entry of your name onto a government database, an ineradicable black mark against your name and your reputation, with no due process for the simple act of daring to say something controversial or even something very often true. More probably, and as happens thousands of times each and every year, you will find half a dozen constables at your door hissing at you. You are under arrest. But there's hope. Common law, which is fundamentally flexible and not prescriptive, is not that hope. It offers no defense. From the Attorney General to the judges to the beat cop in the street, everyone who operates the UK's legal system today now assumes, believes, or more likely pretends to believe, that it is right that someone who posts an offensive tweet or uses offensive language in public should be jailed. Across the pond in America, this is not the case. And moreover, a revolution against this liberal bureaucracy is underway. Thanks to the election of President Donald Trump, in the United States, women's spaces are, by federal edict, presidential edict, now closed to men. DEI is banned in every institution funded by federal dollars. Our nation's borders are closed to illegal entry, and anyone who effectuates an illegal entry will be deported immediately. Government jobs, which are essentially progressive sinecures, are slated to be cut back by 80% or more, with the president simply deleting entire departments which were substantially devoted to the political ideologies which inform UK censorship laws today. America's new leaders are in the process of dismantling the institutions that promoted global censorship. The State Department's Global Engagement Center, or GEC unit, that focused almost exclusively on misinformation, disinformation, and censorship, what we normal people would call propaganda, has been defunded and disbanded. USAID was deleted. DEI has not only been made optional, but it has been banned for federal contractors, freeing much of the American population from the imposition of race discriminatory ideologies in the workplace. And if reporting is right, federal funding of progressive ideology at universities will end next. This is already having an impact in terms of corporate civil disobedience to the UK's laws and the Europeans' laws. Shortly after the election, Facebook blew the whistle on the Biden administration's censorship efforts and indicated it would be joining Elon Musk's X in adopting a pro-free speech posture going forward. Last Friday, Apple let it be known via a leak that it would not be complying with a UK request to backdoor its encrypted cloud services and would turn off its services rather than obey. On Sunday, free speech video website Rumble restored access to Brazil in defiance of local censorship laws, safe in the knowledge that America, once again, would protect that choice. And on Monday, we learned that Labor is considering repealing portions of the Online Safety Act that are incompatible with free speech to avoid the threat of American tariffs. And only yesterday, American Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking in the Grand Palais in Paris, scolded the assembled European heads of government for enacting the EU AI Act and the Digital Services Act, as well as other European laws that hamper innovation and free speech. He warned the assembled bureaucrats that such laws were not compatible with good trading relations with the United States. These laws will surely vanish in due course. What is happening in America, I know how hard this is in the UK. I've been writing about this for 10 years. 10 years ago, nobody cared about free speech. You could write something, the only two people in the country who cared were Baroness Fox and David Davis, and maybe a half a dozen weirdos like me. But what's happening in America today, and what's happened in this country in the last 6 months, should give us hope and a roadmap. The old American permanent bureaucracy was global censorship's main patron, including here in the UK. America now has a president committed to that bureaucracy's total destruction. Some of the largest exporters of woke, particularly USAID, have been routed. The rest of the apparatus is in full retreat, with the government determined to close it down and salt the earth behind them. 4 years from now, none of it will be left. The UK's official censors today have not got the memo. They are working to please a patron and protector who, in short order, will no longer exist. In a network society, censorship is necessarily self-defeating. Just like a pressure vessel filled with boiling water, the longer that true opinion is officially suppressed, the more violent the explosion, the preference cascade, will be once that containment fails. And fail it will if it's not doing so already. As to the roadmap, we should emulate the model once and currently being used by the United States, and not the milquetoast approach adopted by the European Convention. This means backing an outsider political party that, once it obtains power, is prepared to rewrite the British Constitution, enshrine free speech in that Constitution, delete every department, including the Law Commission and Internet Regulatory Divisions of the Home Office, that was involved in suppression of free speech, and retire and replace every single civil servant at any level, including every policeman, every prosecutor, and every judge who played any role in enforcing any law that infringed on the basic liberties of the British people. The American First Amendment thunders, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech." The UK's First Amendment will one day roar that the right of any person and of the people to freedom of speech shall not be limited by the state. Before that can happen, we need to follow the examples of reformers in Argentina, El Salvador, and the United States. Those steps are these. We must have a party adopt our position. That party must win. That party must have a complete program for constitutional and civil service reform on day one, which likely includes the abolition, forever, of parliamentary sovereignty. And that party must be prepared to implement that program, not in years or months, but in weeks. And that is the only chance we have here in the UK that you have to save yourselves. I hope you take it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much to both of our speakers. Have you got any direct questions to each other, first of all? James, have you got anything you
Well,
want
I
to
have a
challenge?
comment. I mean, I felt that the last half of Preston's talk, he was making my case for me, because every single thing that Donald Trump did not involve going through the courts. It did not involve appeals to the First Amendment. It involved tough political choices. I'm all for it. He's right about the European Convention. Again, you know, it wasn't the fight for free speech is a political fight, and everything we've seen in the first 300 hours of the Trump presidency, number 2, has been political. And I'm fully on board with all of that. But the idea that, you know, if anything, the judges in the U.S. are impeding that. And one other thing you need to know, it's technical for the non-lawyers. The U.S. First Amendment applies between the government and the citizen. And so when the big social media companies were disgracefully shadow banning and censoring, the Biden administration was saying, you can't go to court because we're not doing it, and the courts were upholding that in the U.S. First Amendment wasn't doing anything. It's only, you know, it was a lie, of course, because the Biden people were going behind the back and talking to Zuckerberg and whatever his name is, Zuckerman or whatever, Zuckerberg, what is it?
Zuckerberg.
And so, again, so they got around the First Amendment in the U.S. by pretending that it was these big companies doing it on their own. And you get no protection. So I have no objections with everything Preston said on a political level. My only point is that if you think that you're going to achieve it by going through the courts, and even in the U.S., the courts they didn't do anything for people during lockdowns, you're just wrong.
Well, it depends on who's in those courts, right? And so the point is that if you're going to do a constitutional reorganization, the Bill of Rights is a set of articles of surrender. There were 2 combatants, one of them lost, and those are the terms on which defeat was imposed. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone pick up some muskets and wear some tricorn hats and start marching around in Lexington, Massachusetts. That won't work against a modern liberal state, which is dependent on consensus and has mass politics. You can't overthrow that by force. But what you can do, right, is you can win an election, and once you win that election, as Donald Trump has shown us, you can throw, if you have the executive power to do it, as he does lawfully in the United States to do, despite the activist judges doing things with preliminary injunctions and TROs, you have the ability to fire these people who work for you. And so if this is going to work in the United Kingdom, right, we need to follow the model that everyone else has. Everyone in the UK, from ministers all the way down to a beat cop on the street, has it in their mind that if you mouth off to a police officer, you should get arrested for it. So anybody who's ever been involved in doing that needs to be punished for doing so, and the punishment needs to be the permanent removal from state employment for life. And so that is what happens when the victors impose terms on the vanquished. And how you do that is a question for you to decide. I would suggest that this involves significant reform to the British constitutional system, but I would not possibly suggest which party might be able to bring about such reform. That is entirely a matter for you. So.
But a question from me to both of you. Are you not being a bit too trusting of Trump, or are you actually watching closely to see... I mean, you may well agree with what he's doing in general, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a trustworthy ally when it comes to freedom and free speech. I mean, there could well be a point in the measures that he's taking where they start to contravene freedom of speech. I mean, are you looking closely at that?
Well, Jen, you know, we're limited biological creatures. We're flawed. If you're holding any program up against godly perfection, it turns out you fail. But in terms of actually doing stuff for free speech, this is the best anyone in their lifetime has ever seen. Now, it might turn out that after 32 days, he just switches and becomes anti-free. But what we are seeing so far, no one has ever seen across the board. Now, it's partly a function, I think, of the fact that they tried to bankrupt him, they tried to imprison him.
And tried to kill him.
And somebody tried to kill him, and you know he's mightily pissed off, because if his second term had been 2020, he wouldn't have done this. He almost certainly wouldn't. So we can't, I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future. All I can say is, between Musk, who spent double what he had to spend to buy Twitter, so he seems to have done it as a public service. Buying Twitter was probably the single best thing for free speech, having this sort of renegade billionaire who I don't want to have any reflected glory, but his first year at university was the same university I went to in Canada. I don't say that reflects on me, but let's just throw that out there. He has been a force for good, and whatever else you say about Trump, he has been a force for free speech. Now, if you compared Trump's first 20 days to anything that 14 years of Tories delivered here, or anything that 9 years of the Conservative governments in Australia delivered, or anything that even Stephen Harper and they did nothing.
But is there anything that you would be keeping a close eye on? Is there any point where the kind of counter-ideological move would raise your concerns?
Well, that's why I say it's all political. Of course, if someone starts backsliding, you start primarying the rhino candidates. And that's why, to me, it's very difficult with a first-past-the-post system to have an insurgent party. It happens once every 100 years. Out of the blue, Labour took out the Liberal Party 100 years ago. I happen to think that there's a really strong chance that Reform could knock out the Tories. And I think that would be good, because they will not have any obligation to stand up for policies that some of the members of the party don't want to stand up for.
So I wasn't trying to drag us onto a kind of just a political discussion about where we're at the moment. I'm just interested in, is it possible to take a kind of non-partisan stance and then to be alert to threats to free speech even when it's your guy?
No.
Right.
We are engaged in a global battle of wills between two competing ideologies. One will be destroyed and the other one won't. One of those ideologies believes, as it has for the last 100 years, that the government should be in control of private property, and the government should be in control of what you think, and the government should be in control of what you say. The other of those ideologies disagrees with that and says you should be free to decide for yourself how you want to live your life, what you want to say, who you want to say it to, and how you want to say it. So that is, and the basic change of the next 10 years is going to be that we will all have at our disposal vast powers through artificial intelligence and the internet to communicate things to other people and to think about things and to debate ideas and to iterate those ideas. I use ChatGPT all the time in my practice. And I don't use it to do like the primary drafting, but it's like, I don't like this word choice. How do we do it? Give me 5 different options, right? We have this superpower to make us more human, right? The superpower to do human things with more intellectual horsepower than we otherwise had, at greater speed than we otherwise could. And there are 2 forces in this world. There's one of them that wants to control that and control what the AI says and control if you say something untoward online. One of my clients once got a demand from the UK, and we've historically refused that. This client historically refuses those demands. For context, we had a conversation at the Home Office one time, and they said, so we got this Online Safety Act coming. So what do you guys think about that? What are your thoughts, Americans? And we said, well, it's really interesting. If you can put ground troops in Delaware, then we'll have a conversation about it. If you can get tanks right up on the east coast of the United States, if you think you can invade, then we'll have that conversation with you. Sure, no problem. And we haven't heard from them since. Fuck off, England, I suppose is the thing to say. Not England, everybody here, but certainly the police forces who try to say, listen, in America, we're going to control what you think. The difference between 3 months ago and today is that we have the Vice President of the United States scolding every European leader saying that you're going to have to knock this off now because there's a new sheriff in town. And so for at least the next 4 years, the idea that Europe and the UK are going to boss around the United States is old news, and it's just not going to happen anymore, because if you do it, what's going to happen is we're going to hit you with 50% tariffs and your country's going to go bankrupt, period. So that's the new reality. And the question is, in that reality, is it partisan? Is there a way to be nonpartisan? I know the FSU is nonpartisan, and the Adam Smith Institute, of which I'm a fellow, is nominally nonpartisan. I am not partisan. There are people who want me dead. There are people who want me imprisoned, and they want to do things to my children. And there are people who want me free, and there are people who want me to prosper. And it's very clear to me who those people are in politics.
Okay, thank you. James?
I would not take the understanding of what it means to be partisan quite the same way as Preston. So I think there is scope to be nonpartisan. I mean, Donald Trump was just appointed and nominated, and she's been confirmed Tulsi Gabbard. Well, 7 years ago, she was a keen supporter of not Hillary Clinton, but Bernie Sanders. I mean, so he appointed her not for her political views, but because he liked what he thought she would do in terms of taking on the entrenched bureaucracy. And so if we mean partisan as in party political, Well, I think there's scope to have a bipartisan approach if you're picking people who have an underlying commitment to freedom. I mean, you can have a commitment to freedom and believe in a bigger redistribution of wealth. Old-fashioned labor views, the Dennis Healy type of labor person. You know, I have a little. I mean, I don't agree with that in terms of delivering wealth through competition, but I have a lot of time for that. I have a lot of time for the old-fashioned labor view about let's tax people a bit more and distribute wealth. That is totally compatible with having sane culture views and believing that freedom matters. It's just that there aren't many people on the left like that anymore. I mean, one of the biggest things we've seen politically in the last 20 years is the left of center parties have moved from being sort of redistribution of wealth, support the working person parties, which is now what conservatives are, to being the human rights parties. You know, like it's like they're all the human rights left-wing parties. And so that is why the 100 wealthiest counties in 2016 all voted for Hillary Clinton. That's why Boris didn't win any rich London constituencies. People think rich people vote conservative. They do not anymore. They used to. I'm generalizing, but rich people vote for the left because they're not worried about taxes too much. They're sort of attracted to this bizarre human rights woke ideology. And you can cross over that barrier. So I think there's room for partisanship, sort of bipartisanship in the sense of let's take a few Tulsi Gabbards or RFK Juniors and bring them on board. Why not?
And what is the loyally caste? I mean, what is it? I mean, it's difficult to understand it in class terms. I mean, are they just kind of clients of the state who do rather well when the state is growing and heavier? What's your understanding of it?
Well, so if you go back 700 years, lawyers in Britain, at least barristers, went to one of the four inns of court. I spent a couple wonderful years at Middle Temple here. And you were sort of not just taught the rules, but you were inculcated or you were socialized into a certain worldview, right? And that doesn't, there's still going to be outliers. You're going to get a Jeremy Bentham who hates the outlook. Well, law schools perform that function now. And so you bring all these young, smart people together and you send them through 3 years of law school, and you know what? A lot of them start to think the same. And it's a certain disdain for democracy and democratic decision-making. They sneeringly talk about majoritarianism, which has delivered untold benefits. And they have this sense that if you are a lawyer and you can appeal to international, and by the way, international law is the least democratic law you will ever see. It's a disgrace, much of it. Treaties are terrible, and then the non-treaty based international law has not a democratic bone in its body. So I'm always skeptical of people who say you can't do that because of international law. But most students coming through law school would think that it's just morally wrong to ever act against international law. And so the lawyerly caste is my sort of shorthand for there are exceptions. There are lawyers who don't think this way. There are judges. But as a statistical truth about the world, the lawyerly outlook puts you at odds with democratic decision-making to a large sense. And I think that's something we have to try to push back against. I am a big parliamentary sovereignty person. I think in most of the world, your best chance is through the democratic process. As Preston said, every single thing we've seen since Trump came in had nothing to do with the courts. It had nothing to do with the First Amendment. And by the way, he skips over 120 years. I mean, I'm going to quibble historically, but after this great revolution, under John Adams, the second president, you had the Alien and Seditions Act, which was a terrible inroad on free speech. And, the courts didn't do anything. So it by luck or something, in the early 1900s, the case law coming out of the US built up this fantastic body of precedent. Can't be recreated, just cannot.
On the subject of lawyerly castes, I mean, in the United States, the lawyerly caste consists of two groups, right? There's the K Street crowd in DC who are very involved directly in the machinery of politics. And then there are corporate lawyers who work for companies that are usually contractors with the federal government, like Google and things like that. Now, the US federal government spends $6 trillion a year. For context, that's 50%. Is it 50%? It might actually be more than the UK's GDP these days. I'm not sure. But essentially, it is an enormous sum sum of money. America is for Europeans, it's hard to describe mathematically just how rich the country is. We have an insane quantity of money, and about 40% of that goes through the federal government and is handed out by expenditures and grants. For the last 4 years, those grants have been conditioned on adherence to DEI ideology. So you could not get federal grant money if you did not have a DEI compliance program, and you did not impose that on your workers, and you did not impose that on your suppliers and others. I remember I had a big four tech company call me up and say, hey, we'd like to hire your law firm for advice. And I said, great. And they said, well, your team's not very diverse because you're all white, right? And because at least one of you's a woman. That's good. And it was the most naked act of racial discrimination I've ever encountered in business. And I was just like, cool, I'm not going to work for you now. That's ridiculous. But the priorities were set by the state. And then they flowed out, because if you want to get a piece of that federal money, you've got to obey the rules and you've got to follow them. That's gone. Right? And not only is it gone, it's abolished. So if you engage in this kind of conduct, if you engage in censorship, if you try to tell your people what they have to think and what they can say in the workplace, you run the risk of losing your federal money. So the lawyers have been, part of that machine, because we advise our clients, right? Okay, well, you have to have a compliance program that does this and this and this and this. Now that's gone.
That might explain why so many men were claiming to be women, I suppose. I don't know. Anyway, right, we're going to go out to the floor. I knew you'd have your hand up first, John. We've got a number of lawyers, I'm sure, and others. Vinay, if you want to come down the front here. John, if you just stick your hand up so Vinay can see. We're going to do direct questions, so feel free to direct them.
Isn't the fundamental issue here about the appropriate relationship in a democracy between judges and legislators? And don't we in a democracy want legislators to be making the law and judges to be interpreting it? And it seems to me the problem with the Bill of Rights is that you necessarily have very grand principles which give a lot of scope for judges to interpret. So you necessarily give them a huge amount of power. And secondly, with the Bill of Rights, it's very difficult, if not virtually impossible, to change it. So that's the problem we have with the ECHR, which is why we can't control our borders, because all of this law from the European Court can't be changed, because it's basically written in stone. Now, at least with the common law, which is the alternative system, then if Parliament doesn't like a judicial decision or a judicial principle, you just change the law. You pass an Act of Parliament. So isn't there fundamentally a problem, Preston, with the relationship between judges and legislators with regards to democracy, with the model that you're advocating?
So how's the English system working out for you? I mean, I think the proof is kind of in the pudding. The point is, the point is the law is an outcome of a political settlement. The United States has some judge-made rules, right? Those judge-made rules are informed by when they look back to the primary purpose of the system. So when they look at academic opinions and things like that from the 30s and the 20s, which a modern judge will do, they'll ask themselves, well, why does the First Amendment exist? And the First Amendment exists for really one reason, which is to forever abolish the law of seditious libel and scandalum magnatum within the United States, right? The idea that you could, so seditious libel is a crime, right, or was a crime, came from England, it was in the United States, and you can libel someone, you can libel the government or a great man of the realm by saying something that was true, right? So, but as long as it was damaging to their reputation. So if you learned that the king had relations with a goat, and you said, well, the king had relations with a goat, that's not very good, I'm going to run my printing press and do that, they would execute you, right? That was see the case of William Anderton from the late 1600s. So that was something that happened, and the Americans looked at that and said, we didn't like that, so we're going to abolish that. And so with that frame of reference, subsequent decisions, right, look back to that, and they said, listen, how are we supposed to interpret that? We're fortunate that Americans are very ornery, skeptical of the government, and heavily armed. And so as a consequence of those three things, the government tended, and judges tended to interpret our rules in the context of the spirit in which they were originally intended. So the dominant case for political speech, particularly extreme political speech in the US, is Brandenburg versus Ohio. I say versus in the United States rather than and. And in that case, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, which is a pretty vile organization, ran around and said, I think we should I think it'd be good if someone violently overthrew the U.S. government because they're doing terrible things to our society, right? Wouldn't that be great? And he was tried under a criminal syndicalism statute in the state of Ohio and convicted. And the U.S. government said, listen, this is the kind of speech, right, that the First Amendment was designed to protect from the beginning. And that was actually a shift from something which was a case called Schenck. So some of you may have heard the fire in a crowded theater analogy. That's bad law. It has been for about 100 years, more than 100 years, about 110. And so,
Could you just explain that?
So Schenck versus United States was a case where someone was running around handing out pamphlets advocating against the U.S.'s involvement in World War I. The judge looked at that and said, well, that's bad because it creates a clear and present danger that it's going to affect, our ability to enter the war and do this. And so as a result of that, it's like yelling fire in a crowded theater. This is bad, and this man can be punished at law. That was overturned 50 years later by a case called Brandenburg, which I've just mentioned, where someone was saying we should violently overthrow the government of the United States. So there have been mistakes along the way, for sure, but at least for the last 60 years, it's been really clear to American jurists that the purpose of the First Amendment is to allow people to criticize the government in the most censorious terms possible, in the most aggressive, in the most, as long as the expression is nonviolent, you can get as outrageous as you want. So you're not calling for, you're not calling for violence. You're not encouraging someone specifically to do something right there and then that's violent. It's called the imminent lawless action test. So yeah, I think that system is superior. I think ultimately to fix what we have, the situation in the United Kingdom, just saying, okay, well, cool, we're going to enact a UK Free Speech Act is not going to work. You're going to have to undo parliamentary sovereignty. You're going to have to rewrite your constitution. You're going to have to get rid of parliamentary supremacy so that a subsequent government is unable to override those laws, and you're going to have the popular consent to do it. You don't need the consent for very long, right? You don't need to keep that. You don't need to say, okay, well, we're going to have consensus to do this for 10 years. You only need to to get this done, you only need to have it for 1 year. And then you need to do it like lightning. Effectuate the changes, and then see where your society goes after that.
James.
I tend to largely, if not overwhelmingly, agree with the premises of the questioner. With respect, I think Preston looks at the U.S. through rose-colored glasses. I mean, I'm a big admirer of the U.S. I think I'm the most pro-American law professor outside the U.S. But look, I'm Canadian. Canada brought in and they did everything Preston wanted. They brought in an entrenched constitutionalized Bill of Rights. It lays down free speech in blunt terms. And there's way more scope to speak your mind in Australia than there is in Canada, because the judges in Canada do not enforce it anything like the American judges. And we're just supposed to imagine in some make-believe world that Preston's inhabiting that somehow you're going to get British judges who are like Clarence Thomas, or British judges who are like Thomas Alito. You couldn't find a single judge in the entirety of the UK who would do that. You could not. And so that is a very big problem with his. And as I said, the majority of people who are lawyers in the U.S. don't agree with their own U.S. Supreme Court. So yes, while Trump's in power, there's a Federalist Society, there's a thriving group of originalists who think the way to interpret a legal document is to look at the intended meaning of the people who wrote it, which is bog standard, the way everyone saw the world 60 years ago. But it's not the way they see the world when it comes to the European Convention. It's not the way they see it when they look at the Canadian Charter. It's not the way that British judges see it when they look at the Human Rights Act. And so not only do you have to somehow create this written constitution, that Preston wants, you have to somehow people it with people who don't exist. And so that's a little bit of a problem. The only way to deal with this is politically, and when Preston talks politics, I tend to agree with him. But when he talks about this ability to all of a sudden because again, bills of rights don't interpret themselves. When you buy a bill of rights, you buy the views of the judges. And so if you said to me, yes, we're going to get Clarence Thomas along with your First Amendment, and we're only going to get Clarence Thomas. See, what they get in the U.S. is they've had 200 years of understanding that judges are political actors when they interpret a Bill of Rights. And they pick their judges in the most political way going. I cannot tell you how British judges and Australian judges think it's outrageous that, you would question a nominee for the top court. They hate it. But in the US, you put these people through a sort of a vote, and lots of times they get turned down. Robert Bork should have gone on the US Supreme Court, he got turned down. The Republicans blocked Obama's nominee at the end. It's a very political process because Americans recognize that when you're drawing lines on free speech, it's not like you're looking into the head of God and somehow deciding where the line should be. You're making a political call. And so if I want the political call that's going to go my way, I better appoint someone who has my views on free speech. You can't recreate that. I'm happy to hear how you think you're going to actually do that, but I've never heard anyone
I can offer it very briefly. So those of us who are familiar with the writings of American philosopher Curtis Yarvin may be familiar with something called the Wand of Fnargle. And the Wand of Fnargle is a magic wand which gives you absolute dictatorial power over life and death. And you can do whatever you want with it at any time, right? You can just say, this person is gone. You can say, this law is enacted. I'm going to build a building here. I'm going to build a nuclear power station there. But the trick is, it dissolves after 2 years and crumbles into dust. You have that in the UK. We don't. You have parliamentary supremacy. The UK could rewrite its entire system of government with a stroke of a pen, as long as they could get the king and parliament to consent to it. And that means you could write a law which says, here's the new system, here's how it's working. Every judge who's ever heard a case regarding the Public Order Act and convicted someone for something which had anything to do with free speech is now fired hereby by edict of Parliament, by the order of Parliament. And you could wipe the entire slate clean, and you could do it entirely democratically. Nobody's thinking about that, but it's doable as long as you have a parliamentary majority that's willing to do it.
Okay, right. Yes, Elliot, another microphone here, please. Yep. If people show me generally where your hands are. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
These guys are both on our legal advisory council, by
Yes.
the way. Work for us.
Well, you're doing God's work, in my view. So
Yes, and we had a great win today, actually. The Free Speech Union. People might know about it. Higgs versus Farmer School.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So my first question, two questions, different questions. The first one is to you. Don't you think the premise that we effectively we shouldn't have a Bill of Rights because we can't trust the judges, which is your premise, is that not conceptually flawed? Because whether we have a Bill of Rights or not, we're stuck with the judges that we've got. So better to have a Bill of Rights than not.
no, because
Okay, hang on.
we don't have a Bill of Rights in Australia. And so
Hang on a minute.
they can't be as activists.
Okay, and the second question to you, Preston, is I think you said that the Bill of Rights in the States was Articles of Surrender, right? But I put it to you that actually no, it's the other way around. So the Bill of Rights was drafted after a win, so it's a winner's document.
Our articles of surrender are traditionally drafted by the winners.
For sure. But it's still a document drafted by the winners.
Correct.
But I would say the problem that we have, the European Convention for Human Rights, is effectively it was drafted as a loser's document, because you could argue quite clearly that we this is what the alt-right might say, that we lost the Second World War. So we entered the Second War to stop Poland being invaded by a foreign power. But we ended the Second World War where Poland was invaded by a power, an invasive power, the communists. And the European Court for Human Rights was, until quite recently, inhabited by Russia. Russia was literally a signatory to it. So could you not say that the reason why the European Convention for Human Rights is not powerful and doesn't protect is because it's a loser's document?
I don't know if it's a loser's document. I mean, it's a document that was entered after the war ended. Yes, we lost certain aspects of it, but the types of authoritarianism it was intended to forestall were the types of communism we saw in places like Poland, right? The problem is it's been turned on its head by people who sympathize with controlling individual life and subjecting every potential possible thought that you have to state control. So it's not a loser's document, but it's not a winner's document either. It's not a loser's document, but it is not a winner's document either, because we did not create institutions which were capable of withstanding what we're currently living through now.
Thank you. Yes, question down here.
Just comment on that briefly, or not?
If it's, let's see what this chap says. And then.
It seems to me that in this country, freedom of speech is largely being oppressed by medium-level organizations, such as employers who sack someone because they didn't like what they said on Facebook. That kind of thing, or in the staff common room. And it seems to me that neither of our speakers have really addressed what to do about that at that level. Would they like to comment, please?
Great point, because certainly most of our cases, as far as I'm aware, well, very many of them anyway, are about, and by cases we don't just mean they're all the ones that go to trial. Often it's writing threatening letters to an employer or a civic organisation, and that's where much of our work is focused.
I mean, I think that freedom of association and freedom of speech should be paramount, and that should include the freedom to not associate with people with whom you disagree. In the United States, you can do that. If you have someone who expresses something outrageous and offensive that you disagree with, which causes a problem with your business, you fire them. In the United Kingdom, you don't, because you have the Equality Act, and the Equality Act says that a protected characteristic is a system of philosophy or belief. And so as a consequence, if you discriminate against someone on the basis of your philosophy or belief, that is something where, that's something where you can't fire someone for that. That's not a valid grounds for termination. So there are two interpretations. The FSU, generally speaking, is doing God's work, but its view is that if there are certain categories of viewpoints which tend to be discriminated against more than others, so that's gender criticality and right-wing viewpoints, which tend to be right-wing things that are currently regarded as right-wing, but I think 20 years ago regarded as pretty down the middle. And so there are certain things you can't talk about, and those are the things that employers tend to discriminate against. In the United States, the way we would look at it is like, well, that kind of a law itself infringes on the free speech of an employer. It's not a content-neutral rule regarding speech, because it says, listen, if someone says something like this, you can't take this certain action because of your politics, and that your politics might disagree with them. So from our perspective, we would say that that's unconstitutional. So I think that people should be able to do what they want, say what they want, associate with whom they want. And the UK at the moment, you kind of get the worst of both worlds, because if someone disagrees with you and says something outrageous and you sack them for it, you get in trouble, right? And that's an infringement on your speech.
So if we go back in time 5 months, employers in the US were at least as bad as the UK in imposing speech limits on people. What happened was Donald Trump won an election. That's political. And in the UK, what you need to do is repeal the Public Order Act, and you need to stop all the police from running around and giving little non-criminal hate speech things, whatever they are. That's all political. And take the European Convention and throw it out. Forget that for a minute. Canada is not anything to do with Europe. And the same thing has happened as Europe. New Zealand has nothing to do with Europe. And their Bill of Rights has been used by the judges to basically lower the amount of freedom. And look at what's happened in India. Look at what's happened in Israel. It's an international problem. Somehow in the last 40 or 50 years, judges have felt that they can do a better job making these line drawing calls. And I don't think they can. And so, the Australian judges who don't have a Bill of Rights, they have tried to sort of bring one in through the back door, but it's hard because it's patently not legitimate. And so they go off to these international judicial conferences, and they must be pretty depressed because they talk to the Americans and the Canadians and the Kiwis and the judges in Europe, and they say, what do you do? We've decided who can get married. We've decided whether there can be euthanasia. We've made up all these rules on free speech. What have you done? Oh, I had a trust case. Pretty interesting. And I decided a couple of tax law cases. That's what they still do in Australia. And because their tools are so limited, they are much less adventurous. They're still usurping power. But it's not just a European thing. I mean, actually, in some parts of Europe with a civil law tradition, Denmark has a Bill of Rights, a strongly worded one, and the judges have only ever overridden the elected legislature once ever, because the civil law system just does not, by civil I mean the sort of Roman law inherited, they just don't give any status to the judges. You can't get a lower status than French judges, The whole goal, Bentham would have loved France. It's anti-clerical, it's anti-judicial. And, they're not allowed to look at precedent. Yes, we know they do quietly, but it keeps going back to the code all the time. And so it's not just the Bill of Rights. It's the Bill of Rights combined with a common law tradition. Common law tradition on its own is great. Throw in an amorphous set of entitlements in the language of rights. It's like you've weaponized these people who did really well at law school, and they basically think they're really smart, and it's pretty boring just deciding tax cases. it's pretty interesting to decide that I'm not going to wait for the legislature. I'm going to say that gay people can get married, which happened in Canada and happened in the US, by the way. And if you think that a 5-4 vote of the US Supreme Court is a good way to decide who can get married rather than put it through Parliament, we just have to disagree. I think that should be done by Parliament, maybe even a referendum. That's the way to do it. And so there's some problems with the US. Yes, it's true that when you just look at free speech, and only when it's citizen versus the government, again, there were a hell of a lot of problems during lockdown. There was a hell of a lot of problems with social media companies and other employers, and that doesn't trigger the First Amendment, as Preston knows. It's only government citizen. So it's good, and I like it. You can't recreate it, but it's got big flaws too. And it just came about in the early 1900s. The judge who decided that case about the yelling fire in a cinema, by the way, was one of the great U.S. judges of all time, Oliver Wendell Holmes. He recanted because he realized he'd made a terrible mistake. But Oliver Wendell Holmes was a great judge.
Okay, right. Will Vinay is there by the laptop. Have you got a question from the Q&A?
Yeah, right, you can hear me. So, I mean, there's two here for James that I think pertain to the same thing, so I'm going to combine them. So obviously, James, you explain how a First Amendment will not help as it gives powers to judges, etc. But then practically speaking, what are you proposing for free speech in the UK? And the second question links on this, maybe gives a suggestion about common law. Obviously, we have a common law tradition in this country, and that's been exported to Commonwealth and so forth. So how can we strengthen common law, or should we strengthen common law?
Well, I'm trying to be clear. You can do a lot for free speech. We've seen Donald Trump, without going anywhere near the First Amendment or anywhere near the judiciary, has done a lot for free speech in, 300 hours. You could, with a solid campaign set of promises, you could repeal the Public Order Act. There's about 5 statutes that need repealing in Britain overnight. You need to get rid of the Judicial Appointments Act. It must be in the purview of the elected government to appoint the judiciary, and there's nothing wrong with that. Canada does that, Australia does that, New Zealand does that. The law schools will go crazy, but you have to make that a pledge. So there's lots you can do politically, and you can use the executive power to some extent, and you have to pull out of the European Convention. You are completely tied to, so it's even worse in Britain because your judges look to the European judges, and many European countries just ignore what's going on with the European Convention, so you're in the worst possible world. You pay attention to it. The French could care less. And so that was the first question. The second one is, well, I like the common law in the 50-year-old sense, where judges are sort of gradually, through accretion, changing the rules when it comes to negligence or tort law or something. But as the board member for the FSU pointed out, it's bog standard parliamentary sovereignty understanding that if you don't like what the judges are doing through the common law, that Parliament can pass a statute and override them. How many people are confident that today's British judges who've gone through Trevor Allen's classes at Cambridge wouldn't say, you know what, there's some things that Parliament can't do, and completely undermine the sort of parliament? I have no confidence on that front myself. You have a limited amount of time before the judges just start saying, no, Parliament can't do that. Now just make it up. So that's a worry for me. It's happened in Israel, right? The judges have just said there's things that the Israeli Parliament can't do. And what's that based on? We've got a pipeline to God. I don't know what it is. And so, yeah, I think there's lots of things you can do, and you better get started. And they are if you are prepared to do all those things politically, why do you need what Preston says, and to bring in some written constitution, which is a hostage to fortune, might turn out like Canada. It will turn out like Canada. So, I was a refugee from the Canadian Charter. I hated it going through law school when it came in. I'm basically unemployable in Canada because everything we predicted has gotten worse and worse in Canada.
Okay, thank you. There's a chap here, then we'll come over here. Yeah.
Be convinced that this is a political issue. You mentioned...
Now, if I'm lucky, you voted the other way at the first poll. I have a win here. I can feel a win.
I was waiting to hear what you had to say. It is definitely political. Blair started this process.
Ruined your constitution almost.
I think there are lots of things that the politicians that we elect can repeal, can change, and you've listed them. I mean, one of the things I think, and I'm not a lawyer, one should look at is the Supreme Court. We didn't have a Supreme Court. We had the House of Lords that took decisions on judicial processes, I think. And then the Supreme Court was created, I think, by Blair in that building on Parliament Square.
Formerly Westminster Town Hall.
Pardon?
Formerly Town Hall for Westminster.
Well,
Yeah.
Yes, I thank you for that. I would put them back in the House of Lords the next day. You're totally right.
And I think, we have to go back to where we were before this whole political process started. And then perhaps we can then retrieve and find our freedoms again. That's my thought, which is very much supporting, I think, your view.
Thank you. Let's come down here. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Austin Morgan. I am a lawyer, and there are two types of lawyers. There are rich lawyers, and there are less rich lawyers. It's quite a long scale. I voted for Preston for the following reason. One, I published a book about a year ago called Why the UK Needs a Written Constitution, so I was already committed. And I wrote that book because of the 2019 second Miller case in the Supreme Court, where Baroness Hale and her colleagues disregarded very senior judges in the Court of Appeal.
You mean the Gina Miller, not Harry Miller?
Sorry,
Yeah,
Gina Miller.
Yeah, no, so you didn't
Miller
say
2,
Harry Miller, I'm
Miller
just
2.
clarifying. Yeah.
Miller 2 in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
That's why I wrote the book. Now, I've been an advocate of a UK Bill of Rights since the late 2000s. It was a left-wing objective before the European Convention on Human Rights, and then it became a right-wing political objective, and I do support it on a cross-party basis for the following reason. The choice is not really, and I disagree with my learned friend who spoke first, the choice is not really between legislators and judges, because you need both in your constitution. The choice is between Strasbourg or our UK judges. I agree with the Lord's assumption that we should withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. The Conservatives are coming around to that view. Reform is already there. Against it, you will have Sir Keir Starmer and his friend from Doughty Street Chambers, Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, who still occupies his post. And they have said today, we will not shift from the European Convention on Human Rights over our dead bodies. The first dead body is likely to be Lord Hermer, and Sir Keir Starmer, I would give about 2 years of political life. The choice really is between our UK judges, who are less worse than the Strasbourg judges. That really is the choice that a lawyer towards the end of his career has come to.
Just to be clear, you were speaking metaphorically, and that wasn't any kind of threat that could possibly result in a non-crime hate incident being lodged against you.
I always speak metaphorically, including in front of their lordships, where I am increasingly reckless in the way I mix.
Thank you. Okay, any other hands up in the room? Right down the front here. Oh, yeah, we've got you over there. There's one.
Hi there, I'm Alan Cook. I'm actually a representative for Reform UK. I stood in the General and the London Assembly as well. And one of you mentioned the Frankfurt School earlier on, and I think that's where this all actually stems from. We've now, Blair and the 2010 Equalities Act, the Supreme Court, there's so much constitutional damage that government did, the Blair-Brown government. And the normal job of the next Tory government would be to reverse these constitutional damages. However, them also being global socialists, they actually just hammered down and actually made it a lot worse. So now, effectively, we're actually on our third socialist government. So they feel empowered, not because they got a lot of votes, but because they only got 20% of the electorate voting for them. They gave them a huge majority. But because they are the third socialist government on the trot, they think pretty much the electorate is happy to have these ideologies thrust upon us. And I think people are slowly waking up. The centre left, centre right are now seeing, oh my God, we've been played a little bit here. So things are turning, and they already have done in Europe. However, our government, it's looking like we may actually form the next government in 4 years plus time. We don't have, as a government, the sort of executive power that Trump has. We can't sign an executive document and just make it happen. We have the unelected second house. We have to fight things even with a majority through our parliament. Is there a quick way, do you think, we could actually get to the position where Trump is now to reverse all of these damages? We can't, we need to do a siloed attack on it, but, originally the universities were very left-leaning, and then that spread to every level of education. And we've had the civil service, which has always been left-leaning, but the pride and glory and the money-making machine of the UK, the private sector, was impervious to this. However, thanks to the 2010 Equalities Act and DEI, now they've managed to actually infiltrate the private sector.
Yep.
So we're getting all this rubbish thrust upon all the companies. And, it is divisive and it is racist.
Yep.
But they're all actually jumping on the bandwagon and pushing it as well. So we really have got a job to reverse all of this damage.
Oh.
And, it's going to take a long time. Is there any quick way to actually get there like Trump can? Because I can't really see a quick way out of it.
Yeah, so the Frankfurt School, for those of you so communism, I said communism in my speech, and maybe you guys thought, oh, communism, man, this is like some J. Edgar Hoover shit. He thinks that, a bunch of Russians wearing furry hats are going to start, going to invade New York with tanks or something. That's not what I meant. Communism was so thoroughly discredited in the 1920s with mass famines and things like that a bunch of European intellectuals said, shit, these ideas that we've spent our whole lives doing navel gazing on are completely invalid, so we need to reinvent them in order that they have some objective validity, right? So they took class struggle and class conflict and they reinvented it, right? And it became all kinds of other conflict, right? Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s, famous American legal jurist, came up with intersectional theory, right? Which was the racial version that led to DEI and all kinds of other stuff. And the point is so this is Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer, Gramsci, all those guys, Frankfurt School, that's who they are. And so this ideology views everything, every societal relation in terms of oppressor and oppressed, which means that everybody's part of a group, your group is in conflict with other groups, and your individual rights don't matter because the only thing that matters is your group identity. That is 100% of the problem with everything that's going on across the Western world right now, and that is 100% the ideology which informs all of the UK's decisions around arresting people for offending groups and engaging in group libels. So when I say communism, that's the communism we're talking about. We're not talking about Russians with big missiles and singing Katyusha and all that kind of stuff. So that's thing one. Thing two, Gramsci, right, came up with this long march through the institutions, which is very similar to the right-wing concept of leaderless resistance, which is basically that you are supposed to kind of just like, if you believe a particular thing, you just kind of coast through your institution, you believe your thing, you find like-minded people, you quietly conspire, and 30 years later, you overthrow it. And that's what they did. So they infiltrated universities, they infiltrated corporations, their ideology spread, and now they're in charge. So the way that you get rid of that is you get rid of them, and the way that you get rid of them is you fire them. And so the plan that Trump has carried out was very carefully planned over the last 4 years by people like Peter Thiel and people like Elon Musk and people like David Sachs and people like Darren Beatty, and people like Mike Benz. And what they did is they identified every single financial source of support for these ideologies because they hijack the state, they're dependent on the state, they rely on the state, they need it. And what they've done is they've started to engage in a controlled demolition of every single source of financing an organization they have, starting with USAID, moving on to the State Department, moving on to the Department of Education. The federal government will be 80%, mark my words, the federal government currently spends $6 trillion. $2 trillion of that is discretionary. That $2.1 trillion will be about $300 billion 4 years from now. They're going to destroy the entire thing. And they're going to cut down the number of people who are involved in it by about 80%. That's the objective. They're going to do it, and they're going to replace all the bureaucrats with AI. That is the plan. You need to map the state. I'm dead serious. You need to map out, and AI can do it. AI is great. I love it. It's smarter than I am. So you need to map out every part of the British state that needs to be demolished. And then you need to win an election. And then after the election, you need to pass an omnibus act, which destroys every source of funding that funds these particular groups of people, and then what you need to do is you need to replace the system wholesale and fire everybody.
But Preston, you say groups of people. I mean, it's not like there were groups of people that spent 30 years plotting, and they're not even the same people, are they? At the end of the process to the beginning. So in terms of rooting out, I mean, it is a layer of bureaucracy and its departments. But I can see why in the US they're getting rid of DEI departments, and you could probably do similarly over here with HR. But these are not political people in HR departments, are they?
No, they are. Let me tell you the story I heard this morning from a friend of mine. My friend is working on a PhD, and he submitted his dissertation to a committee. And the PhD was about some aspect of Eastern Europe. And the PhD was reviewed by the committee, perfectly decent dissertation. And the committee came back and said things like, well, you didn't mention Marxism in this, and you didn't mention the book that this person wrote who sits on the committee, and you didn't mention diversity, and you don't have a paragraph relating to that. That is how you reinforce those ideologies in the institutions. It's not organized. It's not directed by some central source. You just have a bunch of assholes who impose their viewpoints on other people. They happen to cluster in universities, which is where the most useless people in our society tend to cluster and congregate, particularly in the humanities. And those people rely on government sinecures.
Not wrong.
Those people rely on government sinecures in order to survive. We need to cut them off, we need to throw them out of work, and we need to tell them to become productive members of society and stop brainwashing our children and stop running our governments. That is the solution, to get these people out of these institutions. And they do it because...
But that does sound like a Maoist kind of purge. I mean, how do you...
I don't care what it sounds like. That's what needs to be done.
Can I offer slightly different advice to reform? Because, look, I think the first thing you need to remember is that Trump went to the election with not a small target. He had a big target. He said up front all of the things he was going to do. You need to go in and say, these are the acts we're going to repeal. You need a mandate. As soon as you get a mandate, the advantage of a parliamentary sovereignty system is, assuming you get a majority, you can pass it through the House of Commons. There is no way that the House of Lords is going to block you for very long. And if you think they will block you, you should have in your back pocket, the way they did in 1911 when they brought the first Parliament Act in, you should have a list of 2,000 peers you're prepared to appoint the next day, and you should be clear about that. If you block the will of the people on repealing all of these 7 acts, and the House of Lords does anything to stop it more than for, say, 6 months, we are going to appoint 2,000 peers. And that's what basically led to the 1911 Act. That's what you need to do.
Nobody can hear you from the floor.
600.
So, yeah.
So I think that's a much better thing. On the side, you can decide you're going to clean out some ministries. But at the end of the day, you need to tell people up front so they can't say, we didn't know what we were voting for. Here's what we're going to do. And then you immediately set about doing it. And if you do that, Trump's approval amongst men is now 60%. It's because they said, look, he's doing what he said he's going to do. Compare that to Boris or May or any Tory. Like they just lied. And so what you want is to be clear about what you're going to do, make it a big target, and then from the day you win, do it. And I think you'll be surprised at how popular that is.
Okay, right. Final question. Lady over there with the microphone.
Oh, hi. Hopefully it's going to be a quick one, just a simple one. In terms of the question, we've been...
Just hold... Yeah.
Sorry. In terms of the question, we've been talking very legalistically, very politically. I think one factor you haven't included is that, I call it the man in the street in inverted commas. What happens to the Bill of Rights, whether it will work or not work, if people just don't care anymore about freedom of speech, if they don't think it's important, if they think, for instance, climate change is more important than being able to argue the case? Where does that leave the success or failure? Surely it's irrelevant.
If that occurs, you should leave. So.
Okay, we're going to, because we're coming up to our time, so I'll let you come back to that in your final summing up. I will take you there. If we can get a microphone to the lady right next to you, Vinay. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. First of all, I want to congratulate Trump for for this new Republican Congress, and from the Senate to House of Representatives, it has been amazing. And in the process to achieve freedom of speech, that I think that also would like to congratulate all the conservative freedom, like new media such as Twitter as well as Rumble, and that gives the balance with the left wing, if we call it, but actually just a different view, such as Facebook. I have two questions, small questions. One is, I never get my head around it. I have a question to the gentleman at the front who is from Reform Party, and he suggested, also to everybody else, he suggested actually in United Kingdom, we actually do not have such called executive order. However, at the time when we pass all the House of Commons and the House of Lords is something called Uganda Act, which had received the royal assent as well. But actually, when new government into place overnight, actually that particular bill was vanished. Then the people who has contributed towards that bill in the Conservative government, and also the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary in the previous government, has raised the question, say, do we need to actually go through both Parliament and see whether we want to do something. So I don't quite understand his view. He said, actually, we don't have it looks like we don't have executive power when we want to put things into place. But when we try to abolish it, actually we do have executive power.
Well, you could say that was the substance of our challenge.
I don't quite understand it. I would like...
I was going to say the FSU's challenge to Bridget Phillipson's scrapping of the Higher Education Act was about her abuse of executive power. So
I just feel...
We'll let them... Do you mind if we stop there, because we're running out of time? So okay. I'll let them come back to that. You can take up your question to the Reform chap over wine and beer, which we'll head for shortly. And Vinay, if you could just start running the final poll so we can find out what the audience at home has made of it and where they're going to head. Now, which should I poll the room? No, I'm going to let you guys sum up first, and then we'll take a poll. That makes more sense, doesn't it? So, Preston, do you want to go first and final remarks and try and
keep them brief?
Win the room? Yeah.
We're winning. We're winning. It doesn't seem like it today. You might not think you're winning now. You might think we're on the back foot. The UK, right, has no hope. That we haven't had any change for a long time, right? But the primary sponsor of all of the ideological BS that has been shoved down your throats for the last 10 years is in the process of being subjected to a controlled demolition by the President of the United States. That is going to happen in the United States, just like it has happened in Argentina, just like it has happened in El Salvador, just like it is about to happen in Europe, because the US isn't going to trade with anyone who keeps trying to force this down their people's throats. Once we have seen this happen in the US, once the preference cascade begins, it cannot be stopped. Now, if the UK truly is hopeless, and really everybody in this country truly believes that all of the stuff, all of the censorship, and that saying something offensive on the street, you belong in jail if you say something offensive to somebody else. You walk up to a fat guy, you say, "Hey, chonky, you're chubby, you should stop eating pizza." If that's which is a violation of the Public Order Act. If that's what everyone in this country truly believes, that's really sad, and you should get out, and you should go to America. Dead serious. I don't think that's the case. I think there is an essential decency of the British people where they believe that people should be able to speak their minds historically. Even though we've had censorial laws for the last 500 years, it's been freer than it is today. Traditionally, mean reversions happen. When they happen very, very quickly. So hold on. I think help is coming. It's coming from the United States. We're coming for you. We're going to save you, and you guys are going to save. But more importantly, we're going to help you save yourselves, because they're not going to be able to censor you on Twitter, and they're not going to be able to censor you on Facebook, and they're not going to be able to censor you on anything else. We're going to help you save yourselves, and that's the most important thing.
Well, given that you got us into this mess in the first place.
Yeah, sorry.
I think it's probably the least you can do. So anyway, and just to add it on, in Britain there was a case where even a horse was offended, a police horse, a young protester.
Said someone's horse was gay.
Asked if the horse was gay, I think, and got convicted. So you can even offend a horse. James, final words.
I thought that was stirring. Look, I don't know that we can see the world in such Manichean black and white terms. You're always having to fight for free speech. As I said, after the United States was formed, they brought in the Alien and Seditions Act. It was more brutal than anything we've seen now. And so you're always having to fight. It goes in cycles, up and down. I'm feeling more optimistic about the world than I have in a long time in the last few months. I'm not optimistic about Europe the way you are, but for much of the rest of the world I am. But, you have to go out there and fight. And to some extent, it's our fault. I mean, not many people stood up to the censorship during COVID and lockdowns. You just scare people and they think they're going to die, and all of a sudden they didn't protest in the U.S. very much. There were a few good states. Florida was good, but by and large, people were all on board, and we have to be brave, and you have to be prepared to say things. Free speech is about letting people say things you don't like. No one needs a free speech doctrine if someone's going to say, Jim, you're an incredibly George Clooney-like, witty, charming guy. I'm not going to suppress that. You need free speech for stuff that you don't really want to hear, but every once in a while it turns out to be really important. And so that again is, in a small p political sense, you have to fight, and you have to vote for parties who will uphold it, and then they have to do it. And if they don't do it, you have to punish them. And so these things swing back. But I mean, you are definitely at a low point in Britain right now, because Australia's bad and you're worse. But you at least have some optimism with reform actually setting out. In Australia, we haven't got that. So we'll see what happens. But I actually think this is a battle that has to be won by all of us. If you actually think that 9 judges on a top court are going to do the work for you, you're just deluded.
Thank you. Right, let's have the poll, the result of the poll online.
Who is the winner? Well, I'm happy or sad, depends on how you see it, to announce that yes has won with 61%.
Can you be really clear on what yes means?
Yes, I agree, and that is to the statement: a Bill of Rights would not help protect free speech in the UK.
And what was the percentage?
61%.
Oh, James, well done.
And then
to be fair, I was hoping for 70. So I mean, slightly disappointed.
Would have got 70.
It's better than the 22% that said no, and then 17% said undecided. So those are the online results.
Okay, well, the undecideds are a failure for both of you. So, but excellent. Well, thank you ever so much. Oh no, hang on, in the room. So who agrees now with the motion that a Bill of Rights would not protect free speech? So who's with James? Oh, James. Well done.
The trick is to have a double negative proposition, because half the room doesn't understand what they're voting for, which is a big win for me.
They haven't even had a drink.
I know.
So, okay, and anybody clearly with Preston who you can go and have a little chat with him after? Oh, okay.
Wow.
2, 3.
Excellent.
4. Very good. Okay. Well, thank you ever so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you,
both
of you.
Thank you very much.
For such long trips.
Thank you.